take a minute to I've introduced them, but provide their titles. We have Dr. Ted Cummins, who's the chair of biology in the School of Science. And we have Dr. Ann Belcher and Dr. Christine Fitzpatrick, who are with the Senior Academy. And that's where Dr. Queener is a member and helps us get their assistance with this event. And we love their words of wisdom for all the years that they've been at IUPUI and all that they have learned and all that they have to offer graduate students. Dr. Belcher was faculty in the School of Nursing, and Dr. Fitzpatrick with academic affairs, I believe, as a kind of a right-hand person to the chancellor. Am I correct, Dr. Fitzpatrick?
That's
yes.
Correct, Chief of Staff. I also teach part-time in the School of Engineering and Technology still. So
that's right. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I'll let Dr. Queener and you all kind of take over with and have the participants start asking questions. But if you want to lead the way, Dr. Queener.
Can we see the questions? Let's see. There we go. Well, the original purpose of these chats with faculty was to help a student understand what it would be like to have an interview with a faculty person as part of your application process. So if you have questions related to that, this would be a good time to bring them up. And I'll give you time to put those in the chat or to unmute and speak if you'd like to. Yes.
Hello, good afternoon. So a question that I have, I'll be applying for the clinical psychology PhD program with an emphasis on substance use research. However, one of my concerns has been, I personally am a sober individual and have been for years, and I've done volunteer service in programs to help others in recovery. But I feel like that's something that I probably shouldn't add to an application. However, that is experience working with the population. And I'm wondering what your opinion might be on that.
Ted, would you like to field this?
Yeah, so I'm not part of that program, but I am in the School of Science, and I would have thought that would be relevant experience, a relevant background, and would help you know, the program understand why this is interesting you and that you certainly have some knowledge of the field. So from my perspective, I would say that's not a bad thing to put in there.
Anne or Christine?
I think definitely the fact that you, particularly if it was a volunteer experience, that you want to showcase the fact that you've had a commitment to doing that type of work. You know, I think it's your personal choice whether you want to say that you're a person who's recovering or that you're a sober person. But I think the idea that you have helped that population in a significant way and over an extended period of time, I think would be of importance for whoever's looking at your application.
I would agree. I think that it shows commitment. It shows you know, more than a passing fancy for the subject, that it's been a part of your life and that you're prepared to take the next step and to help others in a more meaningful way. So I think it's that you should not underplay that necessarily.
I'd add my vote for yes as well. So I think you have a unanimous sentiment here.
I am going to offer a little word of caution, though, because I think if you do choose to mention your personal experience, I'm going to say you don't have to spend all day on it, right? You can briefly address that and put it in the light of, this has been a motivating factor for me, and that this has driven my interest in the field. So I don't think you have to spend all day on it.
Anyone else? Well, while you're thinking, I'll tell you that if you do interview directly with faculty, you can expect certain questions always to come up. For instance, I'm always going to look you in the eye and say, what did you learn in that lab experience you quoted? And you better be able to tell me in great detail what you learned. Ted, would you like to share questions you think are important that you would do in a direct interview with students?
Yeah, I mean, so along those lines, if someone says they have experience in a specific lab, then you want to know what was the scientific question that they were addressing. And if they said, well, I was just, pipetting and doing PCR, it kind of is an indication they weren't engaged in the intellectual side of their research. And that's what we want to see, someone who's not just doing something in the lab, but is actually interested in what the scientific question is being asked in the lab.
Right. And you have favorite questions you ask students?
Well, I think one of the things that the PhD review committee looks at or talks about is what are the questions that you're trying to answer? And of course, most of the people coming through for the PhD program in nursing have selected a concentration area, whether it be psychiatric nursing, medical, surgical, and they have a center of inquiry. And so there would be questions that would ask them, what are you hoping to do with this doctoral degree? And what are you wanting us to be able to support you in for the work that you want to do?
Christine, how about you?
Well, my background's in different areas, not necessarily the sciences, but initially the liberal arts, and then in more applied social science fields, education. So if I'm talking to students in my technical communication class and they're starting a master's degree program in that, I would want to certainly get a sense of what they've learned, but also how they're applying that. So I'd want them to deconstruct for me or tell me a process that they go through in a new situation regarding communication or writing or research, just to get a sense of how how they're thinking about or articulating their processes of applying what they've learned to a real situation. And then I think that leads to questions about, so what do you wish you had more strength in? What are some areas that you would like to grow in? And that kind of gets to maybe those paths of inquiry. What would you like to learn more about that would help you with your application?
Mm-hmm. Anybody want to speak up with a question? Well, let me turn it one additional. Let's see, there is a question. Would it be relevant to include in my CV an investigation project in which I would be working a few months after the deadline for the application? I would answer yes. I think even though it's ongoing and hasn't come up with a conclusion, you're going to have a chance to communicate over a period of time, and it may well have time to come to a conclusion by the time you're face to face with someone. So my answer to that question would be yes. Anybody else have a comment about that?
I think as long as you're clear that it's something that's going to occur in the future and you don't have it as something that's already happened, then it's fine, because it shows that you're taking initiative and you've got plans to get more experience. You just want to be clear of that. It's not something you're saying you already did. And that's because then if they ask you about it and it didn't happen, then it's really awkward, right? And so, because if it's on the CV, we'll ask about it, and and you can always say, well, that was set up, but COVID prevented it from happening or whatever. The best thing is always to be honest about your experience and not oversell, because if you get caught in a fib, that doesn't look good at all.
Right. Well, that brings up the direction I was going and thinking about. Are there things that come out in an interview that you definitely see as real problems for a student? And I think Ted has just mentioned catching a student in a fib. The CV oversells a point, and when questioned, it's not there. That's extremely troublesome. Any other things that come up as troublesome points that we want to counsel people to avoid?
So I know there was, when I was over at the med school, we were doing interviews, and one student, we asked why were you excited about research? And they went into this long story about all the practical jokes that they liked playing in the lab. And that was not a good thing. That's not the reason we want them to be in research, is not so they can conduct practical jokes. So that didn't work.
Anne or Christine, any caution?
Well, when Ted was just talking, it reminded me of some interviews I did several years ago. And we had, and some of the rest of you may have a view on this, but we had a candidate who had listed a couple of publications that her name was like third or fourth name, but they were in press. They weren't completed and actually published. And I think being real accurate about whatever you put on that CV, just needs to be honest about that. And if it's not in publication, to be accurate. And if you're a part of a project, for instance, if you had more than just pipetting or doing lab work, to be sure that you note that what your role was. And just a follow-up comment related to COVID. I know a colleague of mine in the School of Nursing had just gotten an NIH proposal funded right before COVID shut down, and her project, and she'd hired her research assistants, were all to do in-person interviews. And of course, all of that got scrapped, and they had to work out developing a questionnaire that could be, used differently than an in-person interview until they could get the equipment and all the things they needed to start doing Zoom interviews. So some of those things, there might be interesting questions that would be posed to you if you had something that happened in relationship to the changes that were required during COVID.
It's a good point. Christine, do you have something to add?
Well, I think I'm going to reflect back on something Dr. Hardy said, that if there's something that needs to be said, that's a story about you that you want to share, just plan for that in advance in case you're asked or it comes up or there seems to be an opportunity for that, and to stick to like 3 to 5 talking points, no more. I mean, I think a person can start going into a story and losing audience attention, but also maybe making oneself more nervous as a result. So yeah, tell the story and then be done with it.
It's good. It's good.
I see a question in the chat. Is it advisable for my recommenders to add a review article I wrote in my letters of recommendation, even though the article area of topic is different from the graduate program I am applying for?
Christine, what do you think? You're a technical writer.
The review article I wrote in my letter, even though your article. Well, yeah, I mean, I think so. I think that I would, that if your review was accepted for publication, for example, I mean, that demonstrates strengths and skills. It's certainly worth promoting and talking about, and meeting deadlines and all of that. Many fine attributes associated with that. So yes,
I would concur. I think writing and contributing to a review article is quite an accomplishment. It should be there.
I would agree too. definitely.
I will also agree, but I think you also want to be prepared for the question of why you are switching fields. And because that's a concern if someone is a serial hopper from one field to the other. I've done that in my career a lot, switched from engineering to chemistry to neuroscience to biology, but you just want to be prepared for that question and what the rationale is for the switch of focus.
Good point.
Yeah.
So Jennifer, have we morphed into the Q&A session?
We probably should make those as one. But I know we also respect the time of we respect everyone's time, but Dr. Belcher, Dr. Fitzpatrick, and Dr. Cummins, if they are not able to stay. But if they're able, yeah, we'll go into more Q&A. And then we will have about 5 minutes of that before Dr. Roper is going to talk about choosing a mentor. So if anyone has any additional questions, otherwise we can have Dr. Roper start early. So let's give it a minute for any other questions. There's one in the chat.
I'm a little bit worried because all my publications are in Spanish. Could this affect my application? May I ask what program you're applying to? Well, we're not getting a response on that. I would think it would PhD in anatomy. Interesting. Interesting, in the education track.
Yeah, so I think it's certainly you want to include them, and certainly if you're bilingual, that's a great thing.
Right.
And you may want to put in some information about what they were about, so that in English, so that the readers who don't speak Spanish can have some context. I think that would be helpful.
One of my early PhD students went off to work in a Spanish-speaking country and ended up publishing a little book of scientific content in Spanish. And I think that's a very laudable thing. It was different from his science training, but in order to do the teaching where he was, he needed to create the materials. So he learned Spanish and did it. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah, I was going to say, other questions, feel free to unmute if you don't want to use the chat, or use the chat. We can wait a minute or two. Sometimes it takes a minute to write a question in the chat. So we'll hang on here for a minute or two.
Yeah.
Okay, the question is it a weak point if all 3 of my recommendation letters came from professors in a single institution that I worked with during the last year? I think it would be fairly common that all the letters come from a single institution. Do you see a problem with that, Anne or Christine?
No, I mean, particularly if you're an undergraduate student at this time, there would be very little opportunity for you to have had exposure in other academic settings. So no, I wouldn't see that as a problem. I think what you would want to be sure about as you pick the people that are going to write these letters is that you help them to understand what you want them to emphasize about you. Because sometimes they may see strengths in you that they'll talk about, but there might be something that you particularly think is important for them to emphasize. And you can help them by sort of giving them a little hint that I thought you would be a really good person to write a recommendation for me because, and then give them some points to consider.
And that's good advice. Ted or Christine?
Yeah, I don't think it's a problem as long as you're giving them what they want. And some programs are very explicit about where they would like the letters to come from, you know, individuals in certain disciplines or individuals who can speak about your leadership or individuals who can speak about you know, potential in a clinical setting. So, and just make sure you meet what they're expecting in the application.
Mhm.
Would agree with that. I think that in my experience, sometimes students will have letters of recommendation from individuals in workplaces, supervisors, managers, and such. And so being mindful of what you just heard from Dr. Cummins, if you're going for a PhD and you want to emphasize research strengths and so forth that faculty have observed, that's one thing. And if the institution you're referring to happens to be primarily a workplace, then you would want to consider maybe branching out to those who are more familiar with the skills that you're going to demonstrate as a graduate student.
Let's
I
take,
think you'd also would want to check and see in the requirements for the institution you're applying for, whether they expect all of the letters to be from academic sources or whether they will take in former employers or clinical type situation references, because there could be a difference there.
Right.
let's see if there's one more question in the chat or unmute before we move ahead to Dr. Roper and then have a break before we do personal statements.
While we're waiting, I'd like to thank Dr. Ann Belcher, Dr. Christine Fitzpatrick, and Dr. Ted Cummins for helping with this afternoon. Thank you, guys. Good to see you.
Good to see you
Thank
too.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you.